We're going to try to do a lapel mic because if I stand at a podium too long, the kinetic energies just kind of build up and I'll explode. So we're going to play a little bit with volume. Are we too high, too low? Doing okay? I was really excited with the invitation, particularly when they told me that this would be a young adult session. I see a few of you are just like me, kind of pushing the threshold of young adult a bit. So I was just excited because then I knew I could get away with not wearing a tie, right? And blame it on trying to blend in. So we will do I've had a few people ask me, is this just for young adults? Is this for people working with young adults? And the answer is kind of yes. So for the young adults in the room, we're going to do our best to talk to you and not have too much of talking about you. But you'll see some of that language that I think we can look at principles that fit for all of us, and we can use them in parenting, we can use them in situations where we teach, and those types of things as well. So I set us up today. I'm using a little bit of a music metaphor for the arrangement of the discussion. I should be the last person to use a music analogy. I started taking piano lessons when I was 8 years old. I took piano lessons for about 2 years. My younger brother started taking piano lessons about 1.5 years after I did. And he had been taking piano lessons for about 6 months. So I'm 2 years in, he's 6 months in. We had our lessons back to back. I would do my piano lesson first, and then I would turn and hand my books to my brother. And then he would have his lesson. You follow what's happening there? So he'd made about as much progress in 6 months as I had made in 2 years. It wasn't long after that my piano teacher called my mother and said, "It'll save you money and save me time if Jason stops taking piano lessons." So I'm not the one should be using music analogies, and I'm sure many of you would be much more adept at this. But I've set us up today with what I'd call a decrescendo approach, right? As opposed to a crescendo that's going to build to its main point, we're going to do decrescendo. We're going to start with the moral of the story, the key points, the main ideas. There's also some other really good reasons for doing this. This means you can stick around for about 30 seconds here, right? Grab the main points and go grab another session. So we are also the session that's right up to lunch. I'm also very smart about the fact that I don't stand between people and food. So we will be really careful about making sure our time fits where we're at. Here's the main ideas, though, that I'd like to emphasize today, and then we'll look at some sub-ideas and sub-principles that'll help us elaborate this a bit. The first key point that I'm emphasizing for us here, and it ties in so very nicely. How many of you were with our keynote this morning, right, with Matt's presentation? Just spot on, just perfect. In some ways, just think of today, this presentation is just an extension of what Matt was trying to capture for us, right? The pornography is a form of sexual fragmentation. By its very nature, in a way that it can never escape, pornography presents a fragmented understanding of human sexuality that undermines couples' efforts to create true intimacy in their marriage relationships. Okay? And that's probably not too radical of an idea. I think everybody in the room probably has a certain amount of, yep, I get that, that's why I'm here, that's what I'm hoping to understand. But the main thing I'd like to tie to that for our discussion is this idea that an understanding of sexual wholeness and an understanding of healthy sexuality is really the only way that we can fully talk about and have an understanding of the harms that pornography can create. And unfortunately, in my experience, particularly as I work with young adults on a daily basis, I'm finding that many of them don't have that broader, richer context. And that oftentimes they've heard about or been warned about, heard cautions and warnings about pornography, but it doesn't fit inside of a broader understanding of healthy sexuality or a vision of sexual wholeness that they have in their own marriage. And so in those ways, it becomes incomplete in many ways. I've noted here, too, for some you may be interested in, I will be pulling some principles from a book that myself and some of my colleagues in the School of Family Life at BYU put together, entitled Sexual Wholeness in Marriage. We use it in the marriage preparation course and in our human sexuality course in the School of Family Life. This one is written in specific for an LDS audience because of that context. We are working with our publisher in our broader version for a more general market version of the book. But some of you may be interested in that resource and a way to go much, much deeper than we can in the several minutes that we'll have today to talk about. So really this concept of thinking about and building our view of that, and in fact, I take this even a step further. An understanding of healthy sexuality is not just helpful. Without it, I believe that in many of the ways that we're warning and cautioning about pornography can actually have unintended negative side effects. And I'm seeing a portion of this, that in an effort to try to give that warning to young people, oftentimes what happens is the adopting of a pretty negative attitude and view of sexuality as a whole. Right? There's a reason why someone like Matt had to start his keynote this morning, right, with wanting to emphasize to us these basic ideas that sex is good, that the human body is good, right, that their interests and passions and desires in the sexual dimension of life are right and good and appropriate and healthy. He's, by his own, saying that is trying to capture that notion that too often that's getting lost, and that's not a part of the dialogue. So without these deeper meanings of intimacy and sexual wholeness, our warnings can have potential harms that can lead to some negative views of sexuality. And then those of us in the counseling circles and in other settings as well, we're seeing a lot of this in our couples in early marriage. As they're struggling with that part of their marriage relationship, but part of it's because of some of the ideas they adopted earlier on, okay? So that's the main idea, is just really for us to think about. One other thing I'd highlight here too is that when we do this in the right way, for young people, for teens and young adults, it gives you something to stand for, not something to stand against. And in the current context, I hear that all the time, how different that is to feel like I'm standing for something that I can articulate. Didn't you feel that with Matt's comments this morning? I can stand for that. I'm standing for whole person love. I'm standing for that type of relationship. I'm standing for that way of relating, right? Rather than just a message that is kind of an anti, right? An anti-pornography message as opposed to a true love message. And there's the understanding and ways that I can think about it and articulate it. So that's one of the other real benefits and patterns we can have here with adopting this type of approach. Part of this is for us to start to be more aware of how much of a sexually fragmented culture we live in. Pornography is a very key example of sexual fragmentation, but it is far from the only form of fragmentation that we see in our broader culture, right? The prevalence of sexual fragmentation in the modern culture, right, particularly in our Western culture, really began with what scholars have called the naturalization or the medicalization of sexuality and intimacy in the 1960s and 70s. Because of this, unfortunately, much of the professional literature, much of what we see in therapy, counseling, and even marriage education has adopted this approach in ways that has furthered a fragmented understanding that focuses and fixates on simply the physical dimensions of sexuality. And now we see that reflected in many ways in our culture, right? Modern healthcare providers and social scientists have adopted this medical model, and what they do is they focus on physical functioning and labels of sexual functioning that are all connected to the response cycle and arousal, right? I've had and been a part of numerous, sex therapy courses and read those, and they're all rooted in our classic understanding of the human sexual response cycle. In fact, many people are having a little flashback now saying, I think I saw something like that in my high school health class. I think there's something where, right? And so if you look at the sexual response cycle here, this is the classic Masters and Johnson sexual response cycle that they introduced in the 1960s, and we started to see this research and this pattern of it. Notice what it displays there. We have a response cycle that's all based on the concept of physical arousal, right? And the idea, we saw the introduction of phase models. You can look at almost every book, many books very well-intending, still ground themselves in these phase models of sexual response, right? One of the reasons why we wrote the Sexual Wholeness book was just to finally have a book that was not based on the phase models, because they replicate all of these common errors and common patterns that go forward. So for example, the shading's a little bit, you can't see there a little bit, but there's shading of what they're calling there those 4 phases in the old classic model there, right? And notice that it shows a line that depicts an individual going through the sexual response cycle. One thing I want you to pay attention to is you could not look at a better depiction of the sexual response of someone viewing pornography than the human sexual response cycle displayed right there. How many lines do you see? Remember, the line represents a person's experience. How many lines are there? Just one. This is one person going through the sexual response cycle. That sounds like pornography to me, right? Notice that the phase happens at the marker point for each individual, often conveying the idea, for example, that if a couple was present, they'll go through the phases at the exact same time. This is where all the married people in the room get to have a little chuckle and you can all start laughing, right? The idea that spouses will progress through the arousal sequence and process simultaneously, right? In fact, it's quite the opposite, right? The responsiveness needed in marriage for us to be aware of how we're different and how we're experiencing that and creating a process that's shared between us. But usually the expectation of there not being simultaneous is actually something that's quite different. So we've been teaching and thinking about sexuality now, even in the professional circles, for an entire generation with an individualized, physically focused, right, process and pattern. And ultimately, that leads us to a number of the misunderstandings and the fragmentations, and then pornography becomes, in some ways, a strengthening of that kind of mindset and that type of idea. How do we get past this? Where do we get ourselves to a new point? David Schnarch, one of my favorite scholars to cite, just because his last name is fun to say. David Schnarch was a groundbreaking scholar and therapist and counselor who was one of the first to really identify this and say, you know what is of value is to identify sexual thresholds. The human body does indeed have thresholds, right, in its responsiveness to sexual touch and sexual experience, but it's missing so much more in its critique. Schnarch's critique was this. He says, current models of human sexuality have failed to account for that characteristic which most sets human sexuality apart from that of other species, the human capacity for intimacy and attaching profound emotional meaning to sexual experience. Getting beyond the fragmentation of the physically only approach. Now, it's not our focus today, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but occasionally, as people have recognized sexual fragmentation that's fixated and focuses only on the physical, we've actually made the mistake of swinging the pendulum too far the other direction, and we could actually have what some might call spirit only, right, or mind only, or emotion only, right, response or fragmentation as well. Wholeness becomes about an integration. It becomes about a balance. So, with the time that we have today, we definitely can't plunge into the full range of all that we would cover, but let's look at a couple of basic ideas that start to give an example of some understandings, particularly as we come of age. When we're in our teenage years, we're in our young adult years, what are some ways to think about and to understand our own sexuality, and what is a vision of what we might call sexual wholeness that then gives us a very different way to think about it. And I'll come back towards the end and try to capture then how if we bring those understandings back, we have different ways to appreciate how pornography harms and how it undermines. And then when we give those cautions and counsels about what can happen and the risks of pornography, they're not just behavioral prescriptions, right? We're not just describing, we're explaining. Now there's motivation to go with it because we can appreciate what will be the impacts and what will be the patterns of it. A key starting point is for us to acknowledge the basic concept and idea of there being a human sexual nature. That it's a part of who we are, it's a part of our design, it's a part of our creation. It is ultimately a way that, of who we are. And to view it in that way helps us then with some of the very fundamental understandings that young people have. Why is there such a powerful draw to the sexual dimension of life? Many young people who get involved with pornography struggle with, why am I attracted to this in the first place? Why would this even be something that would be tempting to me, would be an attraction to me? And the starting point is because you're a sexual being. It's who you are. Pornography didn't create that, right? Pornography distorts it. Pornography counterfeits it. But it ultimately has a tie-in to that fundamental understanding of our beginning nature of who we are. That's a very different pattern and approach for young people to appreciate then, about a channeling and an expressing of that nature, as opposed to something that either is or isn't there, or somehow they should be trying to get away from. Ultimately, it's a different view of that. A simple way, right, to kind of bring this together is to think of dimensions of our sexual nature. A good starting point is to remind ourselves of what I'd call a spiritual dimension. Now, of course, for people of faith and religious devoutness, they would take the term spiritual, they'll tie it into their religious beliefs and faith. But I also think spiritual ties into our understandings of meaning. Humans are meaning-making creatures, right? We have this need to make sense. We have deep, as Dr. Schnarch was referring to, deep ability to symbolize. We see this all the time. It's in basic manifestation of dating and courtship patterns. What is one of the most common conversations young adults have as they come home from a date? And they're often having it with the wrong people because they're always having it with their roommates or their sister or whoever it might be. And they're usually asking the question about some part of the date that just happened. And the question is, what did that mean? Right? And we sit and debate that through. And what do you think that meant? And I haven't received the post-date text. What does that mean? Right? He held my hand. He didn't hold my hand. Right? Call, didn't call. What did that mean? Right? And usually the only person who can clarify that meaning is the person you're talking about, not the person you're talking with. Right? But we want to know what that means. We're trying to understand that symbol system. And does it have the same meaning? And when we kissed, did it mean the same thing for him that it meant for me? Right? We always have this capacity of finding meaning. Research is showing us, for example, that one of the main areas of worry for young people and young adults in the coupling and dating process today is cheating. They're in a culture that they see both in media but also in their broader pattern, people cheating in their relationships. And how do you know if someone is true? How do you know if someone is being faithful? And there's this concern around these kind of patterns. Again, they're making sense of this portion of life. One of the main things we can encourage is to seek to live a life that is authentic and true to the values and meanings we want to have when it comes to sexuality. That was a beautiful part of this morning's session, right? Capturing that idea of who do we want to be and do we live in an authentic approach of that? So when we recognize the spiritual dimension as it connects to the romantic and the sexual part of our lives, we can constantly ask that question, am I in harmony with what I believe? Is this in connection with the things that I really most value? Am I sacrificing something right now in the moment that ultimately doesn't tie into what I want in the long term? This ties in also oftentimes to broader visions about the power and meaning of sexuality in family formation, in procreation, in children. Right? Do we connect all of that together as opposed to something that often gets fragmented and separated from those types of things? The rising generation, right, and I look at many of them, you're all a part of this generation that is living in the culture of no regrets, right? Usually the phrase is no regrets, which is somehow this idea of saying go for it, because you don't want to get down the road and not have regrets. Why is it then as we get older, so often what we most regret is when we went for it, right? No regrets is a wonderful idea, right? But it's about no regrets of, did I live in harmony with who I want to be? The broader values, the broader understandings. We disconnect this. We don't see this highlighted or talked about. Definitely we emphasize an emotional dimension of our sexual nature. We could spend the entire day sitting with the attachment research and literature, right? Seeing some students and others connected down at the School of Family Life at BYU or in other places, right? How many attachment studies have you read? How many do you see that kind of popping up? It's the explosion. Adult attachment research is compelling, showing us how much people are seeking for a sense of security, a sense of trust. The sexual romantic dimension of life is tied to that. It has rich, compelling meanings of either contributing to our sense of exclusivity, our sense of uniqueness, our sense of faithfulness in a relationship, or this can be a part of the relationship that ultimately starts to challenge that. It starts to undermine that. Attachment scholars talk a lot about the distinction of attachment threats and ultimately attachment injuries that come about. So we have to acknowledge this deep emotional component, the symbolism of this, that is so significant in relationships and often doesn't have that kind of fuller thought or appreciation. And then, as I mentioned, we want to keep this in balance, right? That there is indeed this physical dimension, right? And recognizing that as we come of age, every young person comes to the time of life and comes to that period of puberty and growth and change and starts to feel the power of the sexual response of their bodies. Often long before they have the emotional and spiritual maturity to make full sense of that. But often we leave our young people pretty ill-equipped to understand that part of themselves. For many of us, some of the best sex education we received actually happened when we were in Sunday school classes of nursery age, right? We had a whole series of lessons about sensory celebration, right? These are usually lessons about, God gave me eyes, and what can I do with my eyes? And God gave me ears, and what can I do with my ears, right? We sing fun songs like head, shoulders, knees, and toes, right? But as we get older, we leave a lot of other important parts of the body out, right? The most important of which, and this is a game changer for young people to understand, what is the most important sexual organ of the body? It's the brain. Sexual response and arousal originates in the brain. And that's not a psychological concept, that's a physiological concept. That it begins there, and we see those changes in brain chemistry and thought process, and as the body changes and goes through this arousal threshold and that pattern of those things. There's no greater gift you could give to a young person that as they come of age and come into their teenage years, for them to have an understanding of how their body functions like that. Too many young people are coming of age being taught what I call behavioral chastity or behavioral abstinence. They get a list of kind of the do's and the don'ts, right? Often they can describe them, but they can't really explain them very well, and it leaves them quite vulnerable to a number of risks. One of the main vulnerabilities is that it also then is kind of seen, is that a comprehensive list? Because there can always be things that aren't on the list. Plus, people can also do quite a bit of rationalization with that. So they get some nice counsel about don't lie on top of another person or something like that, right, as a chastity behavior. And then they start to do the fun game of, well, 54% of my body weight was technically still on the couch. So technically I was lying next to another person rather than lying on top of, right? And so if behavioral chastity becomes the depth of our understanding, we leave our young people pretty well ill-equipped. A better understanding isn't to focus on behaviors, but to focus on consequences. Know your body. Know how your body responds. Pay attention to that. Arousal awareness, right? Sharing affectionate intimacy, where we share physical touch in romantic relationships, is quite different. That doesn't elicit the arousal threshold. Is quite different than passionate intimacy, where it's the touch that does. How do we want to express that? How do we want to understand that? So what we see is for young people who have an understanding of their bodies, they have an appreciation of how their bodies function, the brain and body connection to sexual response, often are in positions to make much different decisions and have a better understanding and to be more thoughtful about the meaning, right, the reasons, the consequences, right? Plus they have a different type of motivation and appreciation. So this is a starting point. We've covered it very quickly, but this basic idea of the dimensions of human sexual nature. Important for us to emphasize at this time as well that this is true and similar for men and for women, right? Sometimes we struggle in particular to validate and to affirm the concept of the sexual nature in young women, right? So again, many of our young people come of age, and there's actually been this type of distinction. There's probably a few of you in the room that can recall maybe a lesson on from a parent or from a church leader or others. You were taught about modesty. And the lesson somehow had to do with the fact that covering your body because of what that means for young men. Right? And somehow there's this responsibility to help the young men keep their thoughts where they need to be, so you therefore need to be modest. The whole conversation has zero dialogue or conversation about young women's curiosities, interests, and passions in the sexual part of life. Right? So underlying this is a message of men have pathological sexuality, so try to help them, right? And underneath it is a bit of a message of, and women have no sexuality, right? Oh, but somehow, hey, we're really big proponents of marriage, so sometime down the road you want to bring those two together. We need to acknowledge this, right, and be a part of this. One of the main things UCAP is hoping to capture this year, too, is that we get past, even in our discussions of pornography being simply a young man's issue, right, or a male issue. Well, the same thing would be true as we want to understand and appreciate healthy sexuality and sexual wholeness, is that this is a sexual nature and pattern that is there, right, for all of us, men and women. Now, of course, we start to appreciate in ways that there's those physical differences. There may be elements of emotional understanding. But part of our preparation for later marriage is to appreciate the richness and the wholeness that comes from an integration of those perspectives of sexuality and those experiences of sexuality. But it's very, very different than the idea that half of the population has a sexual nature and the other half does not. Right? Plus, the young men can take care of themselves for all I'm concerned, right? Ultimately, it's about understanding our own sexuality and expression, and those messages would be much better given to young men thinking about their thoughts and their approaches to that, as opposed to then trying to make the young women among us the guardians of chastity and those types of things. Young men often have the earlier detection system in the physical response pattern. Why don't we make them the guardians of chastity? Because they're often the ones much more aware when those thresholds are being crossed and when those things are starting to happen. Whole other conversation that we could spend, entire semester with. This is what you get to do. You don't invite the marriage prep instructor, because the marriage prep instructor gets a captive audience who has to stay with him for an entire semester, right? So everything gets built out to be about a 5-hour conversation. One other principle that we'll highlight here. So I think this idea of sexual nature and the idea of acknowledging sexual nature, but then we often talk about and try to help young people, and I think young adults, it's critical for you then to take those dimensions and appreciate then, they help us see some of the levels of sexual wholeness. What do we mean by fragmentation, and what exactly do we mean by wholeness? Well, fragmentation is when any of these significant key areas of integration aren't present in ways that will undermine for a relationship. So the physical and emotional, right? The body and the mind, the body and the spirit, however that language gets pulled together in our understandings, have to be unified. Anytime we separate those, we get something that's fragmented, that's not well understood, right? Like we said, pornography is often an example of this, but so is friends with benefits and hookups and booty calls and everything else in our culture today that is all about engaging in some sort of physical sexual intimacy that disconnects the physical from, right, the emotional, the psychological, and the relational part. So there's a key area of wholeness that we want here. Ultimately, we look at this at the relationship level too. It's a unity between the husband and the wife. Does it strengthen the relationship, or does it become a stumbling block that undermines their intimacy? Different approaches of that make a huge difference. Back to that behavioral chastity idea, one of the main ideas that many young people struggle with, particularly when they're being taught by parents and others about an abstinence approach, or reserving sexuality for marriage, right? If it's done behaviorally, all they have is a concept of that somehow anything before marriage is not right, anything after marriage, right? Well, therefore, automatically it's going to be good, it's going to be right. Unfortunately, there's plenty of selfish behavior in marriage. There's plenty of lustful behavior in marriage. There's no guarantee that just because it moves into the post-marriage context, now somehow it's going to have the right approach. Again, we want to appreciate that piece, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also this idea, as we were saying before, wholeness with our values, wholeness with the meanings, right, that we're living a congruent, public-private, integrated life, that we don't have this sense that there's this part of ourself. There's growing evidence that a pattern of personal concealment like that is deeply tied to consistent patterns of mental health struggles and issues. Not just in pornography or sexuality, but in a broad range of life. Living a public-private split ultimately starts to take its toll. And ultimately, we see elevated levels of depression, anxiety, other areas of struggle when people are trying to maintain that type of split. And in a meaningful, compelling area of life like sexuality, we see this to be the case. So let's talk through this a little bit, just even with some of these basic ideas as we help young people and as young adults, as we embrace and think about our own sexual nature, the need for integration, how then we can approach and talk more deeply and more richly about pornography and why we have concerns about it, right? So sexual wholeness ties into our conversation from this morning. It involves whole person love, where we see and treat each other as feeling, thinking, acting persons, right? When you touch a body, you touch the whole person. Never fragment that, never disconnect that. Their mind, their spirit, their emotions are all there. The same can be true not just in touching, but also how you look at, how you consume. I think this is one of the biggest dangers of the digital world around us. It gives us so many ways to be these kind of voyeurs of bodies, so to speak. And to have that kind of process where we think about and process people, and that's all we have is that thin slice of what they look like, or at least what they're manufactured to look like in that particular image. We know nothing about them as a whole person, right? We have nothing that connects beyond that. So as we start to think about this type of integration then, we can think about the threats of pornography in some unique and powerful ways. This common idea that we understand of objectification, right? Matt said this very well this morning, capturing and turning individuals into objects. The risk for young people in ways that you don't even appreciate is how much this can cause you to start to develop a trait-based attraction. Your arousal template literally starts to be framed more around the features and traits, right, rather than it does a whole person love. The other thing, too, is when you're young, you're still in that deception, too, that those traits will never change. Some of us, yeah, we got a little more chuckle out of that one, too. It's just like the married folks and the simultaneous progression through sexual response, right? After you've been around a little while and you've seen a few more cars come off the assembly line on a few more earlier than you start to appreciate that idea that, my goodness, if our love is based in a long, enduring marriage on just simply these traits, right, these physical traits that we know by definition are going to shift and going to change. Be careful about that. That's a pretty immature way to see, an immature way. I loved how it was said this morning, too. Is this about ultimately what you gift to somebody else, or is this ultimately about what you're taking from them? Objectification becomes that pattern. Unrealistic expectations become a major part that creates this fragmentation. Scholars talk about this notion of pornography acting as a super stimulus, right? Everything about it is false and choreographed. This isn't just in pornography, it's in all of our sexual media, right, that we see around us, the supermodel phenomenon that we see. Have you ever thought about that? Just go to the store, take the first cover magazine picture you want, right, and take that individual and say, what did it take to produce this image? Well, first off, you went out and found the 1 in 1,000 woman, right, that fit a certain body type, age, time of life, whatever, and then you go do a photo shoot and take 1,000 pictures of that individual. And every one of you has experienced this, right? Haven't you seen pictures taken of you at the same time, right? The same event. Maybe it's a wedding reception or something. And someone's snapping pictures and taking pictures, and then you go through that roll of pictures. You do this when you do family pictures, right? You take like 12 of them, and then you sit and debate for hours of which one should we print. Oh, I don't like that one. Ooh, that one makes me look good. Let's go with that one. I look good in that one. Oh, not that one. I have a double chin in that one. No, right? And we go through all of that. So imagine you got the 1 in 1,000 woman. You go take the 1 in 1,000 pictures, right, that you've done lighting and posing and all of this. You pick that one, and then in our day and age, what do we do to that one image? We Photoshop it even more. And then we take that image and we hold it up and we say, this is normal. You could not devise a process to create more of the abnormal. And then imagine what happens if you take images like that and you start training your sexual response and your attraction to that. You start to then pose to this super stimulus. And we haven't even talked about what happens if you start to do surgical, procedures and changes and all these kind of patterns. We get these unrealistic expectations. And what we're finding in pornography, it's not just unrealistic expectations about other people. It's unrealistic expectations about yourself. For all the ladies in the room, I don't know if you'll have any rejoicing in this, but you can at least chuckle a little bit. We have finally created a way to create body image issues in men. One of the studies that we did showed that men who consume more pornography have lower views of their own bodies, right? So ultimately, this pattern that we start to create anxiety in ourselves and unrealistic expectations of others, and the next thing you know, we just have a pattern that doesn't fit very well in real relationships. Pornography also then trains us for this idea of novelty versus permanence, right? We're looking for something that's new. We're looking for something that's different, that's unique. There is nothing that is more of an antithesis than commitment to a person in an enduring relationship and marriage. I get very concerned, too, about the amount of pornography that has non-monogamy scripts displayed in them. That ultimately the idea of being with one person and committed in that relationship and that individual now somehow gets to be seen as a very vanilla way to express your sexuality in life, as opposed to recognizing how important that deep, emotional, spiritual symbolism underneath it, not only for the depth of the relationship, but also for the quality of the sexual experience you have. Always remember, sexual response originates in the brain, not in the body. The connection of that relationship, the endurance, the permanence actually allows us to have that other-centered experience rather than just that self-centered one. Just to be illustrative here, we're definitely not comprehensive, but as we think about are we keeping the physical and the emotional unified, one of the main problems we see for people who become involved with pornography early on in particular, it often becomes a form of mood management for them, right? It's about coping in life. It's turning inward rather than turning outward, which isn't a very helpful preparation for later mature relationships, definitely romantic relationships, family relationships. Rather than proper forms of social support and sharing ourselves in healthy ways that manage, we start to do this kind of pulling in and withdrawing pattern of that. That, too, is not a way to keep that kind of integrated and to build that type of physical, emotional type of union and pattern. So much of this is asking the fundamental question, what do you want sex to mean in your lives? And holding on to that meaning and standing for that and having that as a vision that pulls you forward, right, becomes a very different type of view and approach. Let's talk a little bit about that next level then of unifying husband and wife. I wanted to grab a couple of quotes here and share with you just so you can see the range of resources and evidence that's coming here, right? Even folks who aren't very deeply entrenched in marriage research and read every study that comes out, you've probably heard of the Gottman Institute. Because we have an entire generation of marriage research that has been influenced by John Gottman's research at the University of Washington. And now John and his wife Julie, who's also a marriage researcher and therapist, have established the Gottman Institute. It's one of the most highly regarded, renowned couples marriage institutes in the world. So it catches our attention, and we should catch all of our attention when the Gottmans, with all of their research experience, all of their years of therapeutic experience, write an open letter to all of us about pornography. Here's some of the key things that the Gottmans are warning about and are seeing as they're looking at their efforts to strengthen couple relationships. They say research on the effects of pornography use, especially one person frequently viewing pornographic images online, shows that pornography can hurt a couple's relationship. And what I appreciate is then they go into some discussions of how. I find too many young people who can say, yep, pornography is bad for relationships. How? It's bad, right? The more we can understand the mechanisms of that cause, the better we can appreciate, right, where this happens. The Gottmans go on to say there are many other factors about porn that can threaten a relationship's intimacy. First, intimacy for couples is a source of connection and communication between two people. But when one person becomes accustomed to masturbating to porn, they're actually turning away from intimate interaction. Second, when watching pornography, the user is in total control of the sexual experience, in contrast to normal sex in which people are sharing control with the partner. There can be no worse form of preparation for marital intimacy and shared sexual union than to have an experience that's all about an individual, private, controlled experience. We're a little bit back to the idea of the one line going through the sexual response. There's no attentiveness to anybody else. There's not this issue of responsiveness. There's not this issue of awareness. There's not this concern, right? It becomes something that pulls into ourself. Someone made the comment in the session previous to this of that's why oftentimes marital sexuality and transitioning to marriage doesn't usually help people who are struggling with an ongoing pornography habit, right? It can be of great help as people develop a viewpoint of healthy, mature sexuality and a proper way to express that. But if someone moves into marriage and says, oh, now marriage is going to be what replaces my pornography pattern because now I can just express it this way, they'll come into contrast with what a different reality, right? And that selfishness and that pattern. Notice here this is about the idea of equality, the idea of a side-by-side relationship as opposed to ultimately the hierarchy that pornography prepares us for. The Gottmans go on to say, worse still, many porn sites include violence towards women, the antithesis of intimate connection. And pornography can also lead to a decrease in relationship trust and a higher likelihood of affairs outside of the relationship. Many porn sites now offer an escalation of sexual activity beyond simply viewing porn that includes actually having sex with other individuals. They come together and say, in summary, we are led to unconditionally conclude that for many reasons, pornography poses a serious threat to couple intimacy and relationship harmony. This moment calls for public discussion, and we want our readers around the world to understand what is at stake. This essence of unity, this essence of shared, this essence of coming together in ways that has not only the unifying then of the emotional and the physical, but also in a way that unifies the husband and the wife. That's the vision to have. That's the consequence that's often so misunderstood. It's the one that I also have a lot of sympathy for because I also know that most individuals who develop ongoing struggles with pornography habits typically get involved quite young, before much of this vision is even present for them. As much as we're possible, we want to bring that vision closer to them and talk in these type of open and direct ways. Not that we want a bunch of 15 and 16-year-olds running out and getting married, right? Quite the contrary. But for them to have a vision and an eye to what they will ultimately want this to be. Plus, it does give them a very key idea here that this is about channeling, right? This is about moving towards healthy and proper expressions of their sexual nature and their sexuality, right? That what we're encouraging for them is not a pattern of that somehow being cut off or being removed from their life, which will always lead them to feeling like this is impossible. This is something I can't do because it's a part of their nature and it's something that they won't be able, right? Unless they develop some pretty intense negative feelings about sexuality that then will lead to other types of sexual struggles, right? And that's what I mean by that negative piece of that. Many of the people, young people that we see struggling in early marriage, it's a pattern where they've internalized a negative view of sexuality as a whole at the same time that we've been counseling about the negative expressions such as pornography. They carry that then into marriage and they've got a pretty strong sense of that, but then they have a tough time embracing that positive element. For many of them, then creating some of those mental and emotional barriers, and then they struggle as a couple because they don't see the physical functioning and physical response because, again, it originates in the brain, and they've learned to kind of cut that all out, so to speak, in a way that they don't process it and appreciate it in proper ways. We are always encouraging couples, right? Pulling this a little bit from the Sexual Wholeness book. We're always encouraging couples then to view their relationships and to think about them in broader ways of what ultimately are they trying to create. We help help couples and appreciate the fact that yes, while there is the physical stimulation, what we sometimes call the anatomy of the sexual response that they want to understand and appreciate, they also have to appreciate that there is this psychology of the sexual response as well. All of the research shows us that the psychological stimulation is far stronger in sexual response and functioning than is the physical. But at the same time, we help them appreciate that there's also the physical outputs that our sexually fragmented culture focuses on exclusively, but for them also to be aware of the fact that there are also the psychological outputs as well that will ultimately be the foundation of how this impacts their broader relationship. In simple terms, this is really about a culture of intimacy and what intimacy really is, and helping young people, particularly when they're flooded with displays in the media and other patterns, that sexuality is not the same as intimacy. In fact, sometimes it acts quite a bit as a counterfeit of that very thing. For a fuller appreciation of themselves, a fuller appreciation of relationships helps them in doing that. And young people at much younger ages than we begin can start to have these types of conversations and dialogues. Let me say that really critically, particularly for all of the non-young adults being a part of the young adults, which we're glad that you're here. I hear repeatedly from young adults on a daily basis, what we really, really want is direct, clear conversation. They talk about being raised and being taught about sexuality with object lessons. It's all about chewed gum and unwrapped Twinkies and wilting flowers, and they're saying all the time, can someone just talk to us? Can we just talk about sexuality? Can we talk about our bodies? Can we talk about how we respond and how we experience this? For too many young people, this is kind of the solitary journey as they try to figure this out. And they're left with their resources being Wikipedia or worse, right, as they get that type of information. There's a broader conversation going on when it comes to sexuality and young people in the rising generation. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of who. Who's having these dialogues and who's having these conversations. And I also, in a way that many young people don't always think about, but I also tell them, think about these principles, apply them to your life, think about how they fit for your relationships, but also start to see yourself going forward and being parents and being leaders and being the next generation. And if the chewed gum analogy didn't work for you in that lesson that you had, how would you teach the lesson? And how would it be different? And if you go to something that's more about some direct talk, right, that opens up and shares this part of life and gets into that type of dialogue, there's going to be a whole different context for us to talk about these issues around sexual development, sexual preparation, and inside of that, pornography, and to recognize and view that in different ways. Better be careful. I'm getting close to that lunchtime, aren't I? One last thing here when it comes to this idea of integration of values and meanings. I want to introduce you a little bit to a new area of research that I actually think is probably one that many of us ought to start paying much more attention. I saw in the last session, for those of you that were in this room before, a number of the questions that were asked. We were trying to talk about pornography and dating and how much do you talk about, what do you share with each other. There were some parts of the conversation that were hard to make full sense of, at least they were for me, because we start to equate the idea that all pornography use is the same, when in actuality there's a broad continuum of how it's experienced and what happens. There's a new line of research that's really talking about passions and the passions in life, and it fits very nicely into our views of sexuality and the sexual dimension of life. Interestingly enough, the scholars have coined what they talk about as harmonious passion. Harmonious passion is inherently enjoyable, but it's aligned with our values, and people feel a sense of control and that they're in control in how they express it. So with this type of approach to our passions in life, we're constantly looking to see, do they fit with my broader values? Do they fit with the overall life that I want to have? They contrast this to a pattern of what they call obsessive passion, right? Where there's often regret or concealment in the behaviors. There's a sense that it's not aligned with our broader, fuller values, and the person feels a sense of it being out of control, and they're expressing that passion. Now, this is a passion literature that looks at all sorts of things, everything from people's work, right? We see people who have their approach to how they work in their careers. They find ways that they're harmonious or they're obsessive, and they create that disruption, right? People do this with their hobbies. Some people do this with exercise, right? Do we have a way that it's harmonious? This is a helpful lens for us to think about sexuality and how we express sexuality and a pattern such as pornography. For many, the troubles they get into, they don't really trip to where we'd go to the clinical definitions of addiction, and that label may sometimes be counterproductive when people see themselves and label themselves that way, and then somehow tell themselves that now I don't have control. That's now an explanation. The obsession idea helps us appreciate we create obsessions. We can also uncreate them. They have to do with our identities and our meanings and our approaches to that. But again, this becomes something that we're looking for, that wholeness, for that integration. I find it helpful, and we talk quite a bit about how do we create harmonious passion in life, and how do we have something that's congruent and connected with those broader views that we have. A final thought for us here as our time gets short. At the end of the day, it's hard to prepare unless we know ultimately what we're preparing for. In the broader vision that we've tried to create in our Sexual Wholeness book and the other conversations is really helping young people appreciate this concept of what is called selfless intimacy. That ultimately it's very paradoxical. It's very similar to the fundamental paradox of the New Testament that tells us how to find ourselves is through a process of losing ourselves. Other-centeredness in many ways is the paradox to ultimately experience the things that would be most beneficial and healthy for us as well. Linda Waits and Maggie Gallagher in their landmark book, The Case for Marriage, as they reviewed all of the research that shows that married individuals in committed relationships with deep emotional intimacy always report the best levels of sexual intimacy, the highest levels of sexual adjustment. It's in that context and in that setting, but they capture what is perhaps the essential paradox. They say selfless intimacy can literally double your sexual pleasure. You get satisfaction not only from your own sexual response, but from your partner's as well. Love and concern for one's partner shifts the focus away from the self in a sexual relationship and towards the other person. This selfless approach to sex, paradoxically, is far more likely to bring sexual satisfaction to both men and women. And that's because it's fundamentally in harmony with our nature and who we are, and the nature that ultimately of sustained, enduring relationships. This is the vision that we stand for, right? This is what needs to be communicated as much or more than the risks and the warnings of pornography. When we have a clearer vision for ourselves and those that we talk and teach of what is intended, what is possible, what is the potential, then oftentimes the risks and the harms and the threats become self-apparent and much, much easier to appreciate and to understand. Thank you.